Hi, this is Tara. Let's study Sutra 2, yogaś-citta-vr. Most of us have heard one or two sutras, just to let people know that we know something. And this is the one that gets cited the most. What does it mean? Yogaś-citta-vr. Yoga, chitta, manobuddhi ahankara, which we sort of studied in the first and second sutras. Vritti. What is vritti? Vritti is a pattern. Nirodhaḥ, made famous by family planning in the 70s. Stop. Okay? So, yoga is that which disrupts a particular pattern of the chitta. What is the pattern? How does it disrupt it? That's what each of the gurus explains. So, Maharishi Ved Vyasa's commentary, he points out that the sutra does not mention all the functions of the mind are inhibited, only chitta. Okay, why so? So Maharishi Vyasa explains that the components of the mind are sattva, rajas, and tamas. Okay, rajas is the activation factor, tamas is sort of sloth, and sattva is the true essential element. So we either remain in knowledge, or we get mixed up in the sense objects, or we crave power. When we get mixed up in sense objects, we have tamas or slothfulness. In knowledge, we are in a state of sattva, and when we get mixed up in wanting control and power, we're in a state of rajas. But so basically, what he's explaining is that rajas and tamas, in equal measure, give us, when we are mixed up in rajas and tamas, in equal measure, we have a distracted mind or a vikshipita mind, and a tamas mind alone is fickle, and it becomes a dull mind, a kshipita and mudha. And sattva, which is with a tinge of rajas, is the ekagra mind. None of these are 100%, they're not pure. Sattva mind is that which is inhibited, and it becomes nirodha. So, but nirodha mind is still samprajnata, which we saw yesterday and day before in the introduction and sutra 1, it is still concrete. That is there is external cessation but not internal. And only when all the functions of the mind cease and it becomes asamprajnata, does it, do we attain a true state of samadhi or an abstract mind, or attain a state of yoga. And that is still just an inhibition of chitta. Okay, there's much more. So Swami Satyananda explains that the sutra is this play on four words: yoga, chitta, vritti, nirodhaḥ, that is union, consciousness, patterns, and blocking. Okay, so chitta itself, to understand it, is a little complex, because Swami Satyananda explains that we have several kinds of consciousness, several kinds of chitta. So we have objective consciousness, which is what happens when we interact with the sense organs. We have subjective consciousness, which is what you can call the subconscious and the astral plane. Okay, or we have the unconscious mind, for instance, like when you're asleep, it is the dormant personality, or not when you're asleep, it's still maybe the subconscious, but the unconscious is that which we don't even know. And he recommends that you read the Mandukya Upanishad for details on the planes of consciousness. But what he's trying to explain in this particular context is that if you think that chitta is only blocking, inhibition of manobuddhi ahankara, you will think of it as suppression. Now the problem with that is, if you start thinking of inhibition as suppression, then you're moving towards ignorance. Because the point is not that we don't see, we don't perceive, we don't understand, we don't feel, right? But it is important to understand what is it we are inhibiting. Okay, when we say chitta vritti nirodhaḥ, what is it that is being blocked? It is the subconscious that's being we are pruning the sort of rose bush and removing the things that inhibit our awareness. So we're removing the unconsciousness of the unconscious mind. We're removing the subconsciousness of the subconscious mind. We're removing the subjectivity of the subjective mind. Okay, and then we're opening out into the fourth layer of consciousness, which is what he describes as Atman in Sankhya philosophy, which brings us into a state of awareness. So it's important to understand what it is we are blocking. We are not blocking simply the patterns of chitta, we're blocking the habitual patterns of chitta, the things that keep us in ignorance. We are not blocking awareness itself. So he says that in a state of meditation, you will notice that the patterns of consciousness fall away. Okay, but what the sutra is telling you is that it is fundamentally possible to achieve a different state of being. How? By inhibiting the habitual state of the mind. So when the flow of vrittis change, say when you are asleep, you enter a different kind of consciousness. Whenever the state, the factors inhibiting the vrittis are changing, you're altering your state of consciousness. So yoga is a process of controlling that consciously and entering into a state of consciousness consciously. Okay, so consciousness exists in the body, he reminds us. It cannot exist without the body. So you cannot treat this body as dispensable. You need the body in order to know the state of consciousness, and yet it has to be blocked. Okay, so it doesn't matter. And he says, for instance, a lot of modern mindfulness training, for instance, it tells us that we must undertake these practices to be able to conquer thought or feeling or emotion or negative thinking. What Swami Satyananda is saying is all that really doesn't matter, because this vritti that we're talking about is not that you're having a recurring thought about your ex-boyfriend. Okay, it is a vritti that is much larger. Chitta is infinite. It is, it is a state of awareness. It is a state of consciousness. So what is vritti? Vritti is basically this pattern by which we are constantly reborn and sucked into the samsaric cycle. That is much higher than if you spent a day watching a movie that gave you, some sort of a trigger and you can't get certain thoughts out of your mind. That really doesn't affect your ability to escape the samsaric cycle, because what is going on at a universal level is much, much higher than you and I are able to sort of influence. And that is to gain the capacity to influence that, the higher sort of cyclical patterns that we are falling into from birth to birth. Okay, that is what yoga gives us the capacity to block. So what we are blocking is the pattern of chitta, which is its pattern of re-manifesting. Vritta is a circle, okay, and vritti is circular. So the chitta's pattern is circular. It recurs. It's like a ripple. It's like a wheel. Hence the modes of the mind are chitta vritti. So when we block consciousness from falling into the pattern of recurring and transcending the individual experience in the different planes. Okay, then Swami Satyananda goes on to explain the 5 stages of the evolution of consciousness. And he says that the Mudha state belongs to the Muladhara chakra. That is where the dullness of the mind is. When it awakens and we bring it up to the Manipura, it reaches Kshipita, or the fickle mind. Between Manipura and Muladhara, yoga practitioner can, get pulled back and forth. But if you have successfully managed to maintain your level of awareness in the Manipura, the navel, then consciousness has the capacity to become relatively steady in its ascent as Vikshipita up to the Agnya chakra. And there you start to see real progress in concentration. So Sahasrahara at the crown is beyond the 3 gunas. So all the world, he says, is an interplay of these 3 gunas, sattva, tamas and rajas. It permeates all of creation. And when sattva predominates, the mind is quiet. When tamas predominates, nothing can make you blissful. One guna alone does not predominate, but interacts with the others to create various states of being and of mind. So tamas dominance is, when tamas is dominating, it means suppressing the other 2. Okay, and thinking becomes slow. When rajas predominates, it suppresses sattva and tamas and the mind is scattered. And that's when you can get like suicidal or murderous, kshipita. And when Vikshipita is an oscillating mind, sometimes steady, sometimes distracted, like, you're trying to meditate and you can't really focus. So when the flow of concentration born of sattva is interrupted by unsteadiness born of rajas, one is in Vikshipita. Okay, so and he says that this is also an important stage. right? So you may start a meditation program or a yoga program and you can't continue because though you started very enthusiastically. This is an important stage because what's happening is the gunas are expressing themselves freely, and you should be able to, when the more you get into those layers, the more those layers will start expressing themselves. In this free expressive state, when sattva expresses itself, one-pointedness dawns. When you understand, okay, which guna is at play in which moment, you understand how to eliminate the imbalance. You don't eliminate the gunas, you eliminate the imbalance and the disharmony and the lack of balance between the gunas. Okay, so for instance, you know what the countermeasures are. Say you want to sleep at night and you're not able to sleep, rajas is predominating, so you take up something that's rhythmic and slowing, like chanting, and then you bring in a little tamas to counter it. So you understand how to use the gunas against each other. Then you start exhibiting mastery over the gunas rather than the gunas having mastery over you. So yoga begins at vikshipita. In ekagra, rajas and tamas are absent. Only sattva remains. When you arrive at nirodha, okay, so you arrive at ekagra and then you arrive at nirodha, neither sattva, rajas or tamas can predominate, and you have achieved trigunatitha, or you've gone beyond the gunas. This is equivalent to the awakening of the Kundalini energy. So please note, you have to go through this entire process for the Kundalini energy to be awakened. You cannot go to a class for a month and come for a specific number of hours in a day and be given a certificate at the end of it and told, here, take this, this is your Kundalini energy certification. That does not happen. Okay, it is an entire process which is like this, which as you can see is difficult enough to understand, let alone to practice. So please don't waste your money, right? Now, what does Swami Vivekananda say? What he says is, what is chitta and what is vritti? Okay, and he explains it in terms that the Buddha has also used, in terms of I and I consciousness, though he also uses the term of the mental attachment. So the mind, so you have an I and you have an I consciousness, and then the mind takes it further to the Buddha, which reacts, activating the ego center. And this action reaction is presented to the real soul, that is the Purusha. And the organs, the Indriyas, Manas, Buddhi, Ahankara, everything involved in this chain of action reaction is called the Antakarana. And the Antakarana are the processes of the Chitta. What he calls as vritti is the whirlpool of the mind, and it generates a force of duality, which is either attraction or repulsion. Think of it like a gravitational force from this pool of the vritti. Okay, and where does it come from? It comes from food, it comes from input, and this gets the power of motion, and then the subtler forces make it thought. Hence, the mind is not actually intelligent. It only appears so because of its proximity to Purusha. So he says, you are the sentient being. This is Swami Vivekananda. And the mind is the instrument channeling you towards the outer world. And this vritti, okay, so basically what he's saying is the universe is a reaction of your mind. It's like you're an oyster, and as the dust, okay, gets inside you, the input, the irritation creates a pearl, and you're throwing more and more enamel over it. So we don't get this, because every time we try, every time we're just trying to struggle to free ourselves, we're interacting more and more with the world. We're getting angrier, we're getting more frustrated, we're going on throwing that enamel into the oyster, okay, at the grain of sand, right? And this patterning, this patterning, this everything we do in the course of our everyday struggle, that is the vritti, okay? And it is only when we realize that the realness of us is behind the mind, it is not in the mind, right? And so when the mind becomes as still as a lake, when the ripples have all ceased and you can see the bottom, that's when you recognize that that is your reality. The ripples are not your reality, and you see Purusha. And the clear lake is a state of sattva, serenity, which is not inactive but intensely active. Okay, it is a great manifestation of the power to be calm. So Chitta, he says, keeps trying to return to its primal state, and we keep drawing it out by our interaction with the universe. And only in human form can we find the intellect in the chitta, though chitta is in all animals. So chitta is manifesting in all forms, scattering, darkening, awakening, concentrating. It's constantly interacting with matter, with prakriti, right? And ekagra is what brings us to samadhi. Now, what does BKS Iyengar say? He says union is from the outermost muscle and bone to the innermost. So BKS Iyengar in this sutra, he explains it fundamentally as a balance between the external and the internal, not just a balance but a connection. So he says consciousness has 3 stages of the mind: mano, buddhi and ahankara, being the vehicle of observation, attention, aims and reason. And it has 3 functions: cognition, volition, motion. These are what are activated. Cognition, volition and motion are what are activated through rajas, sattva and tamas. Vritti being the state of the mind, fluctuations, behavior, state of being. And nirodha is obstruction. So he defines it as the restraint of the fluctuations in consciousness. So he says when we study consciousness, we see it has these 3 functions: cognition, volition, motion. And yoga helps us quieten their movements to a state of silence, in which we are able to reach the seat of consciousness. And yoga is the discipline by which we are able to culture and mature the mind. Now chitta is the vehicle which takes the mind, okay, to the Atman or the soul. And yoga seizes the vibrations. He describes chitta as the subtlest form of cosmic intelligence. Okay, Mahat, the source of Prakriti, right? So what is he saying here? Chitta, he says, is the subtlest form of cosmic intelligence. Mahat, the source of Prakriti, which is the physical world itself. So what he's saying is everything in the world, whether it's material, whether it's an object, has a subtle form and a gross form. Okay, so buddhi or discrimination is the gross counterpart of the subtle Mahat, okay, which he says is the source of Prakriti. So chitta is the gross form of chit. For liberation, the highest form of consciousness must work with the highest intellect. So the highest form of buddhi, the highest form of manas, the highest form of ahankara must work in the highest form of chitta to gain a clear perception and to arrive at samadhi. These are linked by the antakarana, that is the mind stuff. So this antakarana is cloudy due to the intermingling with prakriti or the worldly engagement. So the sadhaka's aim is to purify it. Consciousness is what links manifest to unmanifest, evolve to unevolved, and it is closest to the soul. So to put it simply, there is this world which has very gross elements, which has very manifest elements, and there is the state of consciousness, state of mind, which has very, very subtle elements. When we understand that these are a balance, okay, there is an external, there is an internal, there is an evolved, there is an unevolved, there is manifest, there is unmanifest, and when all of these come to balance, okay, then we are in a state of yoga. So yoga integrates the external to the internal, from the intelligence of skin to the intelligence of self, and thus prakriti and purusha become merged. Okay, so please remember that when we talk of union, we're not only talking of union of purusha with ishvara, the divine. We're also talking about the rebalancing of purusha with prakriti, the material and gross to the subtle. So yoga leads to a sattvic state, but to restrain force of will, a subtle element of rajas is necessary. So this is I think one of the most interesting points of BKS Iyengar's teachings, which is he says yoga uses rajas to subdue rajas, if you notice. Okay, so when you flow from dharana to dhyana, concentration to meditation, the sadhaka is uniting individual to universal. The object of meditation goes from individual self to the universal self. So when the mind is focused on objects, it is subject to fluctuation. But when the discrimination faculty clearly separates us from sense objects, the source of fluctuation ceases. So yoga becomes a means of restraining the fluctuations by detaching the mind from the sense objects and locating it back to the original self, the object or dharana. So yoga is thus both a means and an end. What does Osho say? Osho says that yoga is cessation of mind, and he uses the Buddha's words here, cessation, okay, and the mind covers everything, okay, ego, desires, hopes, philosophies, religion, scriptures, okay. Hence cessation of the mind, Osho points out, is the cessation of the known. It is jumping into the unknown and the unknowable. And this is where it kind of leaves science behind, right? Because science is always sort of barking at us to be evidence-based. What is evidence-based? If all you can know is all that you already know, then you are really limiting your mind. So yoga is saying that you have to leave that realm of what is known and what is knowable. And what is mind? We think of it as something substantial. Patanjali, Osho says, doesn't agree. Science also doesn't agree. Mind is a function, it is an entity. And the example he gives is, let's say you're walking, right? You're walking, and then you sit down. What happened to your walking? Where did it go? Did it just disappear? Okay? So, walking, so also thinking is a function, right? So, it is not an object. And he tells this lovely story of how, the great sage Bodhidharma goes to China and he meets the emperor, and the emperor says, can you tell me how to put my mind at ease? So Bodhidharma says that I'm meditating. You come to me at 4 in the morning and you make sure you bring your mind with you. So the emperor thinks this man must be a little mad, okay, whatever. And he goes at 4 a.m. 4 a.m. Bodhidharma says, did you bring your mind with you? So the emperor says, look, it's not something I can leave behind, so I think it must be with me. So Bodhidharma says, okay, we can establish that you can't leave your mind behind. Okay, now locate it and give it to me. So he says, how do I locate it and give it to you? So he says, okay, maybe I'll close my eyes. He closes his eyes and he looks for the mind. And then he looks, and then he opens his eyes and he says, I can't locate the mind. And Bodhidharma smiles and he says, so then that means I have set it at rest for you. Because, if the mind is a thing, all you have to do when it is not okay is to solve the thing. If it is a problem, solve the problem. If it is an object that needs a spare part, give it the spare part. If it is like eating, just don't eat. Okay? So, if you're saying mind cannot be found, then there is nothing to fix. Okay? So, it's yoga is what Osho is trying to tell you is you cannot seek the mind to solve the problem of the mind. You have to achieve cessation. Only when you stop seeking the mind can you solve the mind. Okay? And the word Zen, he explains, for instance, comes from dhyana, which became, jhan or jhanas in China, which became Chan, Buddhism. So the root is dhyana, which means, what is the root meaning of dhyana? Dhyana means no mind. So the cessation of the mind is completely essential to locating and liberating the mind. What does Barbara Stoller Miller say? Okay, so she draws comparisons between the Eightfold Path of the Buddha and the Bhagavad Gita also, of which she is a really great scholar. And she points out that the Bhagavad Gita is also an exposition on yoga, because you have Arjuna performing great feats of yoga in the dialogue on the battlefield. And, she points out that there's a crucial distinction between how Lord Krishna teaches yoga and how Patanjali teaches yoga. And Lord Krishna is teaching you yoga in order for you to be able to function in the world. But Patanjali is teaching you yoga to completely dissolve your attachment to the world. Okay, so in Patanjali there is no manifestation of a creator god like Krishna of life and death. Okay, the Sankhya text, that is Sankhya Karika, is the complement and parallel structure to the Yogasutras. And yoga as a code of practical discipline is amplified by the Sankhya ideal of cosmic evolution, psychological mirroring in the microcosm. okay, which is basically Prakriti to the Purusha. So the basis of spiritual liberation in yoga is a profound experience of the evolutionary process. Like a point in Euclidean geometry, she says, spirit has no material identity except in relation to the phenomenal world. So it is through ignorance, according to Patanjali, that spirit is connected to the world. Alone, it is pure consciousness. So all material nature consists of the gunas, and any entanglement with the gunas is a necessary ignorance, right? So sattva is lucidity, passion is rajas, tamas is inertia, and weighs down the other two. So among the 24 evolutes of the Sankhya theory, Patanjali focused on those that must be broken down to open the gross and subtle fetters of thought. So since what binds the spirit to the material world is itself made of the same material, this is similar to BKS Iyengar saying you have to use rajas to escape rajas. It is harder to understand and separate from. We are using sattva, rajas and tamas. We are using the material world. We are using chitta in order to escape sattva, rajas, tamas, the material world, gross fetters and chitta. It is very important to understand this, right? So together with the 5 sense organs, chitta functions through individual cognition and emotion, right? Thought in the material world is ceaselessly in motion, existing in modifications. The goal of yoga is to still this state of motion. However, since mind is also material in nature, okay, a simple tranquility is not enough. That is why we must seize the mind, okay? So when you control the inner, then gross external aspects are easier to control. So the physical and mental dimensions of the same material nature, if you similar to what BKS Iyengar said, that all the gross has a subtle. So they're essentially the same nature but different manifestations, which is why when the yogi is able to control the subtle, he acquires special powers that allow him to control the gross. So do you understand how that works? So therefore, Patanjali aggregates the expression of chitta through karma and accounts for subconscious predispositions that condition an individual through many lives. Thus, thought and action become cyclical causality. Actions create memory traces, it gets stored, what in Buddhism we call the alya, right? And the storehouse is obliterated only when the chain of causal relations is broken and whatever is stored there gets sort of consumed. If you've practiced Vipassana meditation, then you know what this is about. Same thing, which is why there's so many similarities between Ashtanga Yoga and the Eightfold Path. Liberation is possible only when the subconscious subliminal impressions are consumed and all turnings cease. Therefore, cessation is absolutely the goal. It is not simple control, it is not simple mastery, there has to be complete cessation. Hence, liberation is not the cessation of the world of sensory input, provocations, thought. That is not sufficient. It is complete cessation. Okay, I hope this was useful to you. I think I've gone a little bit over time, but Sutra 2 is very, very interesting and one could easily go on. Join me tomorrow for Sutra 3.